Kevin, thank you. Thank you very much for that. The Hellenic Observatory in LSE and the imminent Hellenization of our organisation is in safe hands, your own, and I will assist. It's one of those environments where it's really good that I can see nobody, because there's people here who have served their country in various ways, which has given them an expertise which, were I to see them, would be daunting. But there's also the likelihood, were I to see any of you, that I'd catch the eye of some of you and say, did I teach that guy? Do I recognise her? Like Andy Murray, who won the Davis Cup for Britain, spotting his brother in the audience and being put off a good shot. So it's, I relish the darkness. I know that Kevin's mentioned I've been here a number of times. I've spoken for LSE here before, and I think this country's been through a lot, and this city's been through a lot. And it was knowing what's been happening here and how a battle for the soul of Europe has been fought here that led me both to be enthusiastic about the invitation and also about the topic. I do want to acknowledge one person in the audience whom I saw before I came in and who's now lost in the blackness, who's my great colleague and friend Kostas Tizinas from the University of London Birkbeck College. And Kostas and I have written a couple of edited books in the last couple of years and talked a lot about the issues of human rights and law in the application to this country. And it's a great thing to see Kostas here, and also a public representative. As Kevin said, it'll be about 40 minutes. And let me just frame it. It's a reasonably serious talk, because I think the topic's a very serious one. And I'm going to start with 3 questions. And they're not rhetorical. And then I'm going to seek, secondly, to answer the 3 questions, or to explain the situation that I have identified through the 3 questions. And that will take us into my understanding of Europe and the project of Europe. And then I'll end, as was anticipated by Maria at the start, with some thoughts about what can be done and where Europe should go. And with Greece in the van of identifying not only the problems, but also what should be done about them. So it's quite an ambitious remit. Let's start with the questions. I'm going to quote a man called Alexander Somak, who's, I think, a great commentator. And he says, in the form of his question, is this: does Europe have the resources? Do we have the resources to resist a Europe in which core democratic institutions, such as parliaments or recurring elections, stay formally in place, while the substance of political decision-making is no longer determined by active citizens and their representatives? Just reflect on it. I was asked in a press interview by Tina, who's here, I think, what's the fear I have for the future? The fear I have of the future is what Peter Mayer in his book called the hollowing out of Europe. We don't abolish parliaments, and we don't abolish the rule of law, and we don't abolish human rights. We probably add, but they begin to mean less and less. I wrote a book 2 years ago called Liberty and Security, in which I coined the term neo-democracy to describe a world which is ostensibly democratic, but the ostentation hides a change. Other people have called it post-democracy, authoritarian liberalism. But Somek's question is a real one. Do we have the resources to resist this hollowing out? A hollowing out we see in the domestic arena. I won't talk of Greece, but I'll talk about my own country, Ireland, in some ways not dissimilar to Greece, where draft budgets are seen by the functionaries of other places before they're seen by elected representatives. I talk about the European Parliament and the drift to decision-making which is beyond and outwith the parliamentary process in Europe. We don't need to elaborate on examples here. The second question, relatedly, quoting a colleague of mine at LSE, whose term is authoritarian liberalism, he says, Mike Wilkinson, what do we do about the fact that, quote, liberal legality has been replaced with authoritarian managerialism? Now, what does that mean? One of the things that we've taken for granted is that we are ruled by rules. Talk more about the rule of law later. But managerialism isn't interested in rules. Managerialism is interested in managing. And if the first question is posed as a result of the emergencies of 2008, the second is also posed as a result of those emergencies. It's the way in which we see organizations, the European Central Bank, the Commission, various European institutions, engaging in activities which are of doubtful legality, to put it mildly. Claire Kilpatrick, a former colleague of mine at LSE, has a brilliant long article in the Oxford Journal of Legal Studies detailing the extent to which there's been a drift away from liberal legality towards authoritarian managerialism in Mike's term. Every now and again, of course, the extra-legal is legitimized by the courts. There's a remarkable, in my opinion, remarkable decision by the European Court of Justice which describes the activities of the institutions outside the European Union as a result of activities by states as legitimate. The European Stability Mechanism in particular. So are we getting to a world where not only do we have hollowed out institutions, but we have organizations that stand outside those hollowed institutions in the name of managerialism running our futures? And thirdly, close to home as a professor of human rights law, a shorter question posed by myself directly. How can human rights grow on paper while they diminish in practice? Gearty's rule is that the more human rights you have, the more dangerous is your human rights situation. We have the impact of Emergency 1 in 2001, when the attacks on the World Trade Center and Washington precipitated not only United Nations and national reactions, but a European Union reaction, which led to a restriction on the civil and political liberties of a number of our citizens and a number of our commercial entities. Quite draconian restrictions, not easily susceptible of accountability under the then prevailing regime. But we've also had, since 2008, and the crisis that afflicted this country, Ireland, Spain, Portugal, Italy, and other places, a shocking impoverishment of opportunity and of real life lived experience, which mocks the emergence of the European Charter of Rights, the growth of a rights world, described by a colleague, Paul O'Connell, as an empty rhetorical promise, speaking of the Charter of Fundamental Rights, or by my friend and co-author of that little book, Freedom Under Thatcher, which I'm rather disturbed to see my commentator has brought with him. So it's very dangerous when you see your commentator has one of your books from when you were a child. Well, we'll see what he makes of it. The Death of Social Europe is what Keith Ewing called it. So those are my three questions. The hollowing out of democracy, what do we do about it? What do we do about the shift to managerialism and away from legality? And what are we going to do about a world which is increasingly having human rights, but the human rights thing is just not something which majorities of people in some countries can relate to, their lives having diminished to such an extent? Well, second part of the talk, is an attempt to understand in order to answer those questions. For those of you who are interested, I have an article in this month's European Law Journal, which is called The State of Freedom in Europe. And what's coming is drawn a bit from that article. And I think I'll overuse metaphors, but I find metaphors very helpful, so I'm going to overuse them. But there's only one here. I want you to picture, I'm trying to explain these three questions, where they come from. I want you to picture Europe in a state of health, a robust Europe, a Europe that's confident, that's growing in ways I will describe. I'm going to describe them right now. And I'm going to describe them by reference to two ideas: the liberty of Europe and the security of Europeans. And over a long period of time, we have had growth in this healthy Europe. And the growth has been about expansion of the imagination of the European project. Now, as you know, management people always tell us, if you're not going up, you're going down. There's no sideways at the top. And Europe has been going up. Consider liberty, and then consider security. This is healthy Europe. Initially, liberty is quite a modest idea in Europe. It's non-interference. Its emphasis is trade, the breaking down of barriers. It's what the Isaiah Berlin crowd might call negative liberty. So we think of the European freedom as the freedom not to be interfered with while we trade. But that's not enough for Europe, and so we grow a liberty in a more republican sense. We grow the notion of liberty as a living in a free place. And Europe begins its move to, it hopes, supersede, at best, or parallel, at worst, nation-state freedom. So we get a Europe that is thinking of itself, imagining itself as a republican space, a free space. And so we see the drive towards elections. You know, if those of you who don't know your history, you know, that wasn't there at the start. There were peculiar things called assemblies, where people would be kind of nominated from the states. But in my time in university, the European Assembly reconstituted itself as a European Parliament. And then the push was on for an elected assembly. And then the assembly, as a parliament, was pushing for political engagement and getting it. And then thirdly, this free space, liberty in the double sense, is a space that also looks at the social, at the positive aspects of liberty, at liberty as a state of being in which you are free in fact as well as in theory, free to thrive. So you get the emergence of the notion of social rights, of the idea that there is not just the liberty to trade, there's freedom of movement, but there's also protections, the anti-discrimination stuff, maternity stuff, protections against disaster. So our model of liberty in our healthy Europe is expanding. And at the same time, this term security is a sister of liberty. The security initially achieved by the European Union, as we now call it, was amazing. Amazing, the prevention of war. As the French foreign minister, if it was foreign minister in the 60s, says, made war impossible, quoted anyway. What an amazing thing. We need to remember it at this time when Europe's on a knife edge. But having achieved a security which was collective within, Europe also embraces its responsibility to protect from outside. And there you see, starting in about 2001, really the reaction to the attacks of 11 September, very different, by the way, to the reactions in the 1970s to terrorism, a sense of a European response being required, because that's what countries do. When we had the terrible terrorism in the 1980s and in the 1970s, Germany, France, actually indirect, Belgium, CCT. Athens had a lot of activities, going through the airport, the Palestinian movement, etc. The Irish in Northern Ireland, ETA. There wasn't really an understanding then of a Europe that had any kind of security obligation to its own people, but that changed. And so security as an idea grew with the European ambition. And then, of course, I've anticipated it, there's the notion of security as a condition of social security, of the safety net. And the Charter of Rights is a delivery of that. So you have, in my metaphor, an image of a healthy Europe that is growing its understanding of liberty and growing its understanding of security, and human rights becomes the unifying language for all of that. Human rights incorporates living in a free democratic country. Human rights incorporates security from attack. Human rights translates these versions of liberty and security into something that makes sense on the expanding canvas of European ambition. But one of the things about being healthy is that it's contingent. And I think we understand my three questions when we remember that there are these, to maintain the metaphor, viruses in the body of Europe. And viruses are containable, but can sometimes spread and be uncontained. And I'm going to suggest to you that from its inception, the European project has had three viruses which have been containable, managed, but which have exploded out of control, and they are now threatening the health of the organism. And their operation together explains the questions with which I began. Firstly, three viruses. First one, nationalism. Now, nationalism has always been part of the European deal. Nobody who understands the history of it cannot see that. The deals between France and Germany, right from the start and so on, were inherent in the common market ideal. It was never a perfect market. There were always special deals. There were always trades. There was always some there was some interest that was pursued through Europe, but that's the point. Nationalism has always been there, but it's been pursued through Europe, whereas now, I think, increasingly, it's pursued despite Europe. People come together in their relationship, and they're intent on maintaining the relationship, and they assert their interests in the context of an effort to retain the relationship, or they assert their interests as an effort to leave the relationship. And I think there's been a shift. I'm not going to say much more about nationalism just now. It's a preparatory virus. There's been a shift in mood in some of these countries. I mean, obviously, I live and work in the United Kingdom, where it's touch and go as to whether this is now going to lead to the rejection of the European project. I doubt it will, but it's touch and go. But nationalism has been containable, and the risks come from its association with the second and the third viruses. And the second and the third viruses are themselves rooted in and connected with each of the emergencies which we have had to cope with in this millennium: the attacks on the 11th September 2001 and the financial collapse of 2007-8. The second virus is a fear of religious extremism. You could call this a virus, an anxiety about identity. There's been a concern about what Europe is for quite some time. And there's been a concern that Europe is not a home for people who are not from Europe, There's been a concern about that. It's been around for a long time. Is Europe a Christian space? And Christian is used here as a term in an odd way. It's a term available to non-Christians. You don't have to believe in the risen Christ to believe in a Christian Europe. So it's a kind of cultural observation about the history of the place and about the past. I did a chapter in a book as early as 1999, which was EU and Human Rights, and my chapter was Racism, Religious intolerance and xenophobia in Europe. So there was enough in the 90s to talk about this growing concern about intolerance in Europe, rooted in a sense of Europe being ours. And of course, 2001 gave tremendous impetus to this. The changes that I mentioned that occurred to the rule of law then impacted entirely on people of Muslim identity, not at all on others. And so we saw, for the first time, the ostensibly universal application of administrative sanctions, which application occurred only against a particular community. And around the same time, we had this debate about whether the Constitution of the United Europe, that liberal idea again, the healthy Europe, the Constitution should characterize itself as a Christian Europe. You remember in about 2004, I think, quite a lot of debates about, are we Christian? Well, then something happened which caused this virus to take off. It happened driven partly by the United Nations, but also embraced by the European Union and by national states. And it was post-Madrid, the particularly awful attack there in Madrid just before the election in the mid-noughties. And what it was the idea that we have to tackle extremism, not violent extremism, extremism because it leads to terrorism. This is a construct that's emerged, as so often ideas we think we've come to ourselves come from right-wing think tanks. In America, it's called the conveyor belt theory. You have an extremist, the extremist is traveling on the conveyor belt, and the conveyor belt ends with terrorism. And the UN has pushed states, and the EU has joined in to challenge extremism. After the Paris attacks in January, Charlie Hebdo attacks, the European Council committed itself to a course of action aimed at, quote, preventing radicalization and safeguarding values. And now we're involved in the development of communication strategies to promote tolerance, non-discrimination, fundamental values, and solidarity throughout the EU, including narratives to counter terrorist ideologies. And then the Commission, without any citation, without any evidence, say, extremist propaganda has been shown to lead foreign terrorist fighters from Europe to travel abroad to train. Now, why am I exercised by this? Because once you decouple extremism from violence, you have to define it, because it's no longer controlled by criminal action. And extremism then inevitably becomes infringing our values. And our values are theoretically universal, but they are ours. And so a particular part of the population is disowned, Muslim population. This is played out at the United Nations, this is played out at the European Union, this is played out at national level. My own country has had some shocking examples recently of questionnaires being sent to Muslim children about how often people come to dinner who are not members of their family, how much political conversation there is at home. One boy, whose name was unsurprisingly Mohammed, talked about eco-terrorism in French class and was taken away and sent to the security officer. There are thousands of referrals. We're creating a Europe in which fear of religious extremism is dividing Europe into a Europe of us and a Europe of them. The reaction to the appalling attacks in Paris could, in my opinion, have done more to stress how Europe embraces all its peoples. Neoliberalism. Some people say it's not a term that makes sense. I think it makes easy sense. It's, for the purposes of this discussion, our third virus, and it's about the addiction to the market as valuable in itself rather than as instrumental in the production of the good life. Now, we've had this dimension to the European project since it started. Obviously, the common market. We've had it in international institutions since the war. Bretton Woods was designed as a market, not an accountable market, a market control. But it's been constrained since the war by social democracy. And social democracy was designed to provide a firewall against rampant communism to our east. And I don't need to say that in a country which suffered shockingly when the so-called war was over, supposedly, in an extirpation of radical protest here. Now, the story that made sense and constrained neoliberalism, the virus, the third virus, ended in 1989. The left had taken the entrenchment of its values in social democracy, I think, largely for granted in the 60s and 70s. The right set about undoing the compromises it had grudgingly made between 1945 to 1989. We've had, therefore, my questions emerge, overriding of democratic institutions. We need to recall that for the market, democracy is an aberration. It's something that gets in the way, but has to be tolerated. Well, does it now? Surprising has been the way in which markets now, the managerialism referred to by Mike Wilkinson, can sometimes depart from law, so confident has it become. And what we see are cracking down on protest against the consequences of the market, which crackdowns are now being characterized. We've seen it in Paris. We've seen it in Paris, the protests being controlled over the climate talks as extremism. So efforts by democracy to fight back against market-based departures from democratic values, those efforts are condemned as extremist, as in violation of the values that in fact they are seeking to uphold. Power can do that. Power can turn your own values against you. So entrenched is this ideology of market supremacy that it becomes a solution to its own problems. So it causes collapse, but is the source of the solution to collapse. Now, these three viruses have interacted together: the reassertion of national interest, the fear of religious extremism, and the ideological commitment to the market, to give us a Europe which is capable of producing the three questions with which I started: a place where democracy is hollowed out, where law is replaced by managerialism, and where human rights is more honoured in the breach than in the observance. The three, law, democracy, and human rights, remain. That's where I started with Alexander Somek. They remain, but they are there to preserve our belief in them even when we know that the facts mock them. And we end up with what Wolfgang Schrick says: one cannot but be afraid of the possibility of a new, however temporary, settlement of social conflict in advanced capitalism. This time, says Schrick, a very distinguished sociologist, entirely in favor of the propertied classes now finally entrenched in their politically unconquerable institutional stronghold, the international finance industry. Remember, the international finance industry was always outside the democratic deal and has now, as it were, swooped. I'm not going to talk about the refugees, and I'm going to begin to wind up by turning to my third point. But the refugees, in some ways, this shocking, terrifying, terrible story, is a story that captures so much of what I've described. These people are not just fleeing from social conflict, they're fleeing from the impoverishment of their own countries. And we see national reactions to them which are now increasingly flouting communal agreements. We see departures from law, and we see a shocking intolerance. Now, where does it leave Europe? Well, Schreck says, is this the new settlement, however temporary? How temporary is it going to be? Is the refugee crisis with the financial crisis, is this the high point of the viral attack from which Europe will recover? Or will Europe become a set of gated communities where the rich get themselves extremely well educated, where they have police outside their restaurants, all in the name of counterterrorism, and where they make sure they don't leave the motorway at a junction which leads them into an area where they and their children will never visit, where their schooling is all with people just like them, as is their university experience, where we have segregation as a credible response to the selectivity of liberty and security. Well, my final part of my talk, we need to resist that. And what we need to do, you know, I don't think it's as complicated as people make up, but it's quite difficult to pull off. One is, what is it we need to do, and then who will do it? Well, one, we need to restore social democracy. I don't think we abolish markets, but we do control them, and we're not ashamed of it. And we realize there was an historical moment when we controlled them because of communism. We need to control them even without the fear of communism. We need to reduce wealth divisions. We need to let people go if they can't take it. We need to make opportunity for all real. And we need to stop, I'll end on this point in a moment, the neoliberal race to the bottom. We need to stop it. We need to stop pointing out a place even worse than ours, which means that we have to be bad ourselves. How do we do it? Well, we need to encourage political equality. It's really, really important to try and control money's impact on the political process. That's what's finished America. I don't know any route back for America. I think America should just auction the presidency and then spend the money on guns, I suppose. We need new solidarities to assert social democracy. Governments are not incapable of doing this. Governments might learn from the capacity to produce a climate deal that actually it's handy to be able to agree things. We need civil society. We need the courts. Courts have a fantastically important role because they take seriously the language in the law, and that's what annoys them to government, who want merely hypocrisy. Trade unions are vital to this, and as are political parties, actually. Now, people will usually say, well, Europe, this is my very last point, Kevin. People usually say, well, Europe can't do this because we live in a globalized world and we have Singapore and we have China and so on. But I think Europe needs to have a bit more confidence. I don't think Europe can destroy itself because other places have destroyed themselves. I think we need to be confident about our values. And our values are universal values. All we need to do is communicate them. Which part of the world doesn't want a chance to grow as an individual within a community, in security, with some basic safety nets against failure? Which part of the world doesn't want that? I don't think you'll find it. And sure, it might mean that Europe runs against the grain of neoliberalism for a few decades. But the Irish, I was always brought up to believe that Europe hit a dark age in the 6th, 7th and 8th centuries, with one exception. I was always told in school it was the Irish. That all the monks were, all you Visigoths, whatever you are, and Vandals and things were beating each other up. I don't know what you Greeks were doing. And the Irish were in their little monks, were writing out all the beautiful things. And then when you lot calmed down, we went back out. And we re-Christianized Europe. That's our story, and we're sticking to it. But Europe might do the same to the world when it gets over its obsession with destructive hate and neoliberalism. Thank you very much.